The human body is capable of a remarkable variety of movements. Everything from small motor functions like picking up a pencil to creating powerful movements like running and jumping. Human movement can be fluid and graceful like a ballet dancer or powerful and dynamic like a sprinter. The study of human movement is called kinesiology. We'll be discussing some of the basic principles of movement and the terminology used to describe specific movements. If you're unfamiliar with these terms, please don't get frustrated. They'll come with time and practice. But first, an overview. Movement is a complex coordination between the mind and the body. The mind, or the brain, provides the stimulus for action, and the muscles and bones provide the mechanical force necessary to carry out that action. Let's take a look at the process that makes this possible. The human brain and spinal cord make up what is called the central nervous system. The brain, like a computer, processes all data and sends messages to the peripheral systems for action. The basic unit of a nervous system is the neuron, or the nerve cell. The brain itself houses over 30 billion neurons. Talk about a possible traffic jam. There are two types of neurons, sensory and motor. Sensory neurons collect information from sensory organs such as the skin and send them back through the spinal cord to the brain. An example would be if you were standing by a hot stove and your skin sensed the heat, it would send a message to the brain that there was danger. On the other hand, your motor neurons are responsible for sending messages from the brain back to the periphery. In our example, they would signal the muscles to contract and move away from the hot stove. The end of a motor neuron that innervates or contacts a muscle is called the motor end plate. Let's talk a little bit more about muscles. Muscles are the engines of the body. They consume energy and provide the force necessary for movement. There are over 600 muscles in the body, and they can be classified as one of three types: smooth, cardiac, or skeletal muscle tissue. Smooth muscle tissue is found in internal organs and is controlled involuntarily by the brain. Cardiac muscle tissue is found in the heart and is also controlled by the brain. Skeletal muscle is the third and is responsible for voluntary movement. The bundles within bundles of muscle fibers covered by sheaths of connective tissue called fascia. The smallest increment is a thread-like protein strand called a myofibril. This represents a single muscle cell. Myofibrils are a combination of two protein filaments called actin and myosin. There can be thousands of these filaments in each muscle cell, and they are arranged in alternating light and dark bands called striations. If you've ever taken a good look at a piece of steak before you cook it, you can see these. The predominant theory of muscle contraction is called the sliding filament theory. And let's say my fingers represent the myosin and actin filaments. The sliding filament theory says that when a muscle cell is stimulated, the actin and myosin filaments slide across one another, and the result is a shortening of the muscle. When the muscle fiber is stimulated, the fiber contracts with full force. In other words, there are no degrees of contraction where a single fiber is concerned. This is called the all or none principle. Given this principle, you might ask how the body is capable of producing different forces for varying workloads, like the difference between picking up a pencil or lifting a 40-pound bag of dog food. The body regulates the degree of force by stimulating more fibers to contract or fewer. Example, if you ever gone to pick up something and the first time you couldn't do it, your mind had miscalculated the number of fibers needed for the task. So you go at it again and you can pick it up the second time. Muscle fibers can also be specific to a certain task. There are three major categories. There are fast twitch, slow twitch, and intermediate fibers. Fast twitch fibers provide a lot of force and dynamic power, and their weakness, however, is that they play out quickly. Slow twitch fibers, on the other hand, are more for endurance-oriented activities. They provide lengthy work efforts of less intensity. They're not as powerful or as fast, but can sustain moderate intensity movement longer. The third is an intermediate fiber that can go either way, dependent upon the need and also upon training regimens. Contrary to popular belief, each person is born with a certain number of muscle fibers that never changes. Increases in the size of muscle due to weight training occur because of an increase in the size of the protein filaments. Likewise, most people are born with pretty much a 50-50 split between fast and slow twitch fibers. Athletes who excel at one type of sport or another, like endurance runners or power lifters, may have a greater percentage of one type or another, which gives them a genetic advantage. There are 3 different types of muscle contractions. Let's take a look at those. The first is isometric. Isometric contractions are those where there is no joint movement. An example is if I tried to push that wall down back there, the muscles would certainly be exerting force, but there would be no movement at the joints. The second type of contraction is called isotonic. These involve movement at the joint and can be classified as either concentric or eccentric contractions. Concentric contractions occur when the muscle length is shortened. This is also called positive work, as with the bicep curl. Alternately, an eccentric contraction involves the lengthening of the muscle. This is also referred to as negative work. The return phase of the bicep curl is an example of this. It's very important in a group exercise to encourage participants to control their movements, particularly through the eccentric phase. The natural tendency is to let gravity take over and let the limb drop. This reaction can cause damage to joints and decreases the effectiveness of the exercise. The last type of muscle contraction is called isokinetic. We'll not go into depth about this type of contraction since it requires a special type of machine and equipment to produce. Basically, though, it's in a contraction in which the tension in the muscle does not change throughout the full range of motion. In contrast, in normal movements, the pull of gravity varies depending on the joint angle. Therefore, the tension in the muscle varies under normal conditions. The closer you get, generally to 90 degrees, the more difficult it is. Now, if we were all just a bunch of muscles, the movements we're capable of now still would not be possible. We'd look more like a blob of jello or Jabba the Hutt in Star Wars. Muscles must have a stable lever to act upon. These are our bones. The human body has 206 bones that can be divided into 2 sections. The axial skeleton is 80 bones that comprise the head, the neck, and the trunk. The appendicular skeleton is the 126 bones that form the extremities. Besides providing a system of levers for the muscles to act on, bones provide several other functions. They provide protection for vital organs. They support soft tissues so that the body can stand erect. The marrow within the bones produces red and white blood cells. And the bones also serve as a storage area for calcium, phosphorus, potassium, sodium, and other minerals. Important health note: weight-bearing exercise has been proven to be one of the best preventative measures against osteoporosis, a degenerative bone disease afflicting predominantly women, but which can be a threat to both men and women, particularly the elderly. The body responds to weight-bearing exercise by increasing bone density. In particular, weightlifting has been shown to be effective. So, let's look at how muscles and bones work together. Muscles and bones are attached via a thick fibrous connective tissue called a tendon. The attachment points are called the origin and the insertion of the muscle. Origin means just what it sounds like, where the muscle originates, and the insertion is at the end. The origin and insertion of a muscle can tell you a lot about the movements made possible by that muscle because the muscle's contraction occurs along its longitudinal line, or the direction that the fibers are running and are arranged to pull the 2 points together. Let's look at the bicep muscle to see what we're talking about. Now, the bicep muscle is what we call a two-headed muscle. That means it is broken into 2 sections and has more than one origin and insertion. The 2 heads attach at and above the shoulder, and the insertion points are at the radius and ulna of the lower arm. As the muscle contracts along its longitudinal line, the directions the fibers are running, the 2 points of attachment are drawn closer together. We'll discuss other muscles and their movements in a later section, but let's move on to joints. Joints are the articulations between bones, and they provide the axis for movement. Bones are joined together by fibrous connective tissues called ligaments. The body has several different classifications of joints, but for our purposes, we'll be talking about the most freely movable joints. These are called the diarthrodial or synovial joints. Synovial joints are distinguished by having a joint capsule, which is filled with a lubricating fluid called synovial fluid. The end of the two bones are also covered with a thin layer of cartilage to provide some shock absorbency. Synovial joints are classified according to the movements that they allow, and the most common types of joints used in exercise are the hinge, the pivot, and the ball and socket. Let's look at a hinge joint. A hinge joint works just like a door, opening and closing. This type of joint allows movement in only one plane. Examples are the elbow, the knee, and the fingers. A pivot joint allows for rotation around a single point, and the articulations between the first and second cervical vertebrae of the neck are a perfect example. It allows the head to pivot from side to side. The third type, the ball and socket joint, is the most freely movable type of joint in the body. Examples are the shoulder and the hip, and they have a very large range of motion. Range of motion describes the degree of movement possible at each joint and is dependent upon several things. The first, of course, is its joint structure itself. Obviously, some joints are designed to provide a greater range of motion, like the ball and socket joint versus the hinge joint. The second factor in determining range of motion is the flexibility of soft tissues and connective tissue around the joint. This can be influenced by genetics, age, gender, or activity level. Range of motion is also influenced by temperature. That's why it's important to warm up the body before engaging in large dynamic movements. As we'll discuss later, working to maintain flexibility can decrease the risk of injury and improve quality of life, particularly for the elderly. Let's take a look now at movement patterns of the body. The body is capable of what we call triplanal movement. Let's take a look at these three planes. The sagittal plane runs down the midline of the body and divides it into right and left. Movements in this plane, let's take a look at those, are flexion and extension. Flexion means to decrease the joint angle. Extension means to increase the joint angle. Other possibilities are forward flexion and extension at the spine, shoulder flexion and extension, elbow flexion and extension at the wrist, flexion and extension, at the hip, flexion and extension, at the knee, flexion and extension, and at the foot, plantar flexion means to put the toe down, and dorsiflexion means toe up toward the shin. Also, directional movement forward and backward falls within the sagittal plane. Picture a wagon wheel that can only move forward and backward to help you understand the sagittal plane movements. The second movement plane is the frontal plane. It cuts the body into front and back, or anterior and posterior. Movements in this plane are usually referred to as lateral or out to the side. Examples are lateral head flexion, shoulder abduction, which means moving away from the body, shoulder adduction, which means moving toward the body, shoulder elevation and depression, spinal flexion, hip abduction and adduction, and foot eversion means the outside edge of the foot is up, and inversion means the inside edge is up. The last plane of movement is the horizontal or transverse plane, and it divides the body into upper and lower, or superior and inferior. Movements in this plane include the head pivot, spinal rotation, shoulder horizontal flexion and extension, shoulder rotation, hand pronation, which means thumbs in, and supination means thumbs out. There are also a few multiplanal moves. These include circumduction at the shoulder and the hip, like drawing a circle in space. Also, opposition of the thumb. This is unique to primates and humans. And pronation and supination of the foot, which are complex movements that we'll not get into at this time. Let's do a quick review of those movements at each joint and the terms we use to describe them. Let's take the shoulder first. Shoulder flexion and extension, abduction and adduction, horizontal flexion and extension, circumduction and rotation. At the shoulder girdle, you have elevation and depression, abduction and adduction of the shoulder blades. At the elbow, you have flexion and extension. And at the wrist, flexion and extension. Pronation means thumbs in, and supination. On the spine, you have forward flexion and extension, lateral flexion and extension, and at the hip, you have flexion and extension, abduction and adduction, circumduction and rotation. At the knee, you have flexion and extension, and at the ankle, you have plantar flexion, toe down, and dorsiflexion, toe up, inversion, and eversion. The body has an incredible ability to be strong and yet flexible at the same time. Ask any engineer and they'll tell you that that is a hard combination to achieve. Take a few minutes now and review all these movements. Try to classify the plane of movement for each. We'll discuss the specific movements for muscle groups in a section on strength. When you come back, we'll take a look at how to train for aerobic fitness.